In the scorching heat of September 1101, on a sandy plain where two roads crossed, 260 knights and 900 foot soldiers stood against an Egyptian army that stretched across the horizon like a dark sea, and our silver-armored good knight was there when King Baldwin I gambled the entire future of Jerusalem on a single, desperate charge into the heart of 32,000 enemies. This wasn't just another skirmish in the Holy Land. This was the moment when the fledgling kingdom of Jerusalem, barely 2 years old and surrounded by hostile powers, faced annihilation or survival at the crossroads of Ramla. Watch as the first 2 divisions are wiped out in minutes, as the Lord of Haifa is cut to shreds, as panic spreads and the battle seems lost, until Baldwin and his final reserve of 50 knights, including the good knight, hurl themselves into the thickest part of the fight in a charge so ferocious it shattered the Egyptian center and turned certain defeat into legendary victory. From the vicious, hand-to-hand combat in the suffocating heat to the bizarre fog of war that convinced everyone the king was dead, this is the story of how 1,160 men held the line against impossible odds and saved the Crusader kingdom from collapse. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive historical journeys, where our eternal knight in silver armor walks you through the battles that shaped civilizations, with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which desperate medieval battle you'd like the good knight to survive next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful September morning when the fate of Jerusalem hung by a thread. Chapter 1. The Sand and the Silver. The good knight had learned over the years that sand has a memory. It remembers the weight of armies. It remembers the blood that seeps into it, the way it clings to the boots of the living and the faces of the dead. On the morning of September 7th, 1101, as he stood on the coastal plain near Ramla, he could feel that memory beneath his feet, a shifting, unstable foundation that seemed to whisper of all the battles that had come before and all that would come after. The heat was already unbearable. It was not yet mid-morning, but the sun hung in the sky like a forge, radiating a dry, suffocating warmth that turned the air itself into a physical burden. The good knight's mail hauberk, usually a second skin, felt like a cage of heated iron. Sweat pooled beneath the padding of his gambeson, running in rivulets down his back and sides. His conical helmet trapped the heat against his skull, and even the leather straps of his kite shield seemed to burn, where they pressed against his forearm. Around him, the other knights of King Baldwin's army shifted in their saddles, their horses stamping nervously. The animals could sense what was coming. They always could. The good knight looked out across the plain. The Egyptian army was a dark line on the horizon, stretching from one edge of vision to the other. It was not a line, really. It was a sea, a living, breathing mass of humanity that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Banners rose above the host like the masts of ships, green and gold and black, snapping in the hot wind that blew in from the coast. The sound of their drums carried across the distance, a low, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. 32,000 men. That was the number Fulcher of Chartres, the king's chaplain, had whispered as he moved through the ranks that morning, offering blessings and prayers. 32,000. The good knight did not know if that number was true. He had learned long ago that numbers in war were often more myth than fact, but it did not matter. What mattered was what he could see with his own eyes. An army so vast that it seemed to swallow the land itself. And against them, Baldwin had brought 1,160 men, 260 knights, 900 foot soldiers. That was all. That was the entire strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army, gathered here on this sandy plain at the crossroads of two ancient roads, the Via Maris, which connected Cairo to Damascus, and the road that linked the port of Jaffa to the holy city itself. If they lost this battle, Jerusalem would fall. The good knight knew this. Every man in the army knew this. It was not spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like the heat, pressing down on them, making every breath a little harder, every heartbeat a little faster. King Baldwin I sat on his war horse at the front of the army, his face unreadable beneath his helmet. He was a tall man, lean and hard, with the kind of restless energy that made him seem always on the verge of movement. The chroniclers called him rash and reckless, and the good knight had seen enough of the king's decisions to know that the description was not unfair. But Baldwin was also a survivor. He had fought at Antioch, at Jerusalem, at Arsuf and Caesarea. He had carved this kingdom out of hostile land with nothing but will and steel, and he had no intention of letting it slip away now. The king raised his hand, and the army fell silent. "We are outnumbered," Baldwin said, his voice carrying across the ranks. "We are tired. We are far from home, but we are not defeated." He paused, letting the words settle. "The Egyptians think they can take back what we have won. They think they can march up from Ascalon, cut our supply lines, and starve us out of Jerusalem. They think we will run. They think we will hide behind our walls and wait for them to come for us." Baldwin's horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a firm hand. "But we will not run. We will not hide. We will meet them here, on this plain, and we will show them what it means to stand against the kingdom of Jerusalem." A murmur ran through the ranks, not quite a cheer, but something close. The good knight felt it in his chest, a tightening, a quickening. It was the feeling that always came before a charge, the moment when fear and excitement became indistinguishable, when the body prepared itself for violence. Baldwin turned his horse and began to move down the line, speaking to his commanders. The good knight watched as the king divided the army into 6 divisions, 6 separate corps, each one a small, self-contained unit. It was an unusual tactic, especially for such a small force. In most battles, a commander would keep his men together, using their combined weight to punch through the enemy line. But Baldwin was not most commanders. He understood that against an army this large, a single charge would be swallowed whole, surrounded and destroyed. By dividing his force, he could probe the Egyptian line, test its strength, and keep a reserve under his personal command to exploit any weakness. The good knight was assigned to the 6th Division, the king's own reserve. It was a position of both honor and terror. They would be the last to enter the fight, held back until the decisive moment. If that moment came, they would be the ones to decide the battle. If it did not, they would watch their comrades die and then follow them into oblivion. The first 2 divisions moved forward. They were led by veteran knights, men who had survived the First Crusade and the brutal years that followed. The good knight recognized some of them, faces he had seen in the camps at Antioch, in the streets of Jerusalem after the siege. They rode with their lances lowered, their shields raised, their horses moving at a steady trot across the sand. The Egyptian army did not move. They stood in their ranks, a wall of men and spears and bows, waiting. The Sudanese archers, tall and dark-skinned, stood at the front, their composite bows already strung. Behind them, the Arab and Berber cavalry sat on their lighter horses, swords and lances gleaming in the sun. And behind them, stretching back as far as the eye could see, were the masses of infantry. Men with spears and shields, men with clubs and daggers, men who had been promised gold and glory if they could drive the Franks into the sea. The First Crusader division struck the Egyptian line like a hammer, For a moment, it seemed as though they might break through. The good knight saw the lances punch into the front ranks, saw men fall, saw the line waver. But then the Egyptians surged forward, and the Crusaders were swallowed. The archers loosed their arrows in a single devastating volley, and the sky darkened with shafts. Horses screamed and fell. Knights tumbled from their saddles, pierced through gaps in their armor. The infantry, trying to support the charge, were met with a wall of spears and cut down where they stood. The second division charged in to support the first. They met the same fate. The good knight watched, his hands tightening on his reins, as the two divisions were rolled up, crushed, annihilated. Hardly a man escaped. Those who tried to flee were run down by the Egyptian cavalry, their bodies left scattered across the sand. The sound of the slaughter carried across the plain. The screams of men and horses, the clash of steel, the wet, tearing sound of blades finding flesh. The third division, led by Hugh of Tiberias, charged into the center. Hugh was young, a warlike Euvenis, a landless knight seeking glory and a name. He rode at the head of his men with a ferocity that bordered on madness, his sword already drawn, his voice raised in a battle cry that the good knight could hear even from a distance. For a moment, it seemed as though Hugh's division might succeed where the others had failed. They punched deep into the Egyptian center, scattering the archers, driving the infantry back. But then the wings of the Egyptian army closed in. The Fatimid cavalry, thousands strong, swept around the flanks and surrounded Hugh's division. The good knight saw the banners of the Crusaders disappear into the mass of the enemy, saw the flashes of steel, saw the dust rise in great clouds as the two forces collided. And then, slowly, inevitably, Hugh's division began to break. Men turned their horses and fled, pursued by the Egyptian cavalry. Others were dragged from their saddles and killed where they fell. The 4th and 5th divisions tried to support the center, but they too were engulfed. The good knight sat on his horse, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Around him, the men of the 6th division were silent. They had just watched half of their army die in the span of minutes. They had seen their friends, their brothers, their comrades cut down like wheat before a scythe. And now it was their turn. King Baldwin sat at the front of the division, his eyes fixed on the battle. His face was pale, his jaw set. The good knight could see the tension in the king's shoulders, the way his hand gripped the hilt of his sword. Baldwin was calculating, weighing the odds, searching for the moment. And then he saw it. The Egyptian army, believing the battle won, had begun to pursue the fleeing Crusaders. Their ranks, so disciplined and tight just moments before, were now spreading out, becoming disorganized. The cavalry had ridden ahead, chasing the survivors toward Jaffa. The infantry, eager for plunder, had broken formation to loot the bodies of the fallen, and in the center, where Hugh of Tiberias had struck, there was a gap, a thin, fragile opening in the Egyptian line. Baldwin turned in his saddle and looked back at his reserve. "This is the moment," he said, his voice calm, almost quiet. "If we do not charge now, we will all die here. But if we charge, if we strike the center with everything we have, we can break them." He paused, letting the words sink in. And with that, King Baldwin I spurred his horse forward. The good knight did not think. He did not hesitate. He kicked his heels into his horse's flanks and followed. Chapter 2. The Charge of the 6th. The world narrowed. It always did, in the moments before a charge. The vast expanse of the battlefield, the thousands of men, the banners and the dust and the noise, all of it collapsed into a single point of focus. For the good knight, that point was the back of King Baldwin's helmet, bobbing up and down as the king's warhorse surged forward across the sand. The 6th Division moved as one. 50 knights, perhaps 60. It was hard to count in the chaos, hard to know who was still alive and who had fallen in the earlier waves. But it did not matter. What mattered was the momentum, the weight, the terrible, unstoppable force of armored men and horses moving at full speed. The GoodKnight's horse was a destrier, a war horse bred for this exact purpose. It was not fast, not like the lighter Arab horses the Egyptians rode, but it was powerful. Its hooves pounded the sand, each stride covering more ground than seemed possible. The GoodKnight leaned, forward in his saddle, his lance couched under his arm, his shield raised to protect his left side. The weight of his armor, which had felt so oppressive in the heat, now felt like a second skin, a shell of iron that would carry him through the storm. The Egyptian center was directly ahead. The GoodKnight could see them now, individual faces, individual men. Sudanese archers, their bows still in hand, turning to face the new threat. Arab infantry, scrambling to reform their lines, raising their spears and shields. And behind them, the Fatimid commander, Sa'd al-Dawla al-Kawasi, sitting on his horse, his face a mask of shock as he realized what was happening. The Crusaders had been broken. The battle had been won. And yet here, impossibly, was another charge. The GoodKnight's lance struck the first man in the chest. The impact was immediate and total. The lance, a 12-foot shaft of ash wood tipped with a steel point, punched through the man's leather armor and into his ribcage. The GoodKnight felt the resistance, felt the moment when the wood splintered and the point drove home, and then the man was gone, falling away, and the lance was useless, broken, and the GoodKnight let it drop. He drew his sword. It was a long sword, 3 feet of double-edged steel, heavy and brutal. The GoodKnight had carried it for years, had sharpened it so many times that the blade had a slight curve to it now, worn down by use. He raised it above his head and brought it down on the helmet of the next man he passed. The steel rang like a bell, and the man crumpled. Around him, the other knights of the 6th Division were doing the same. They had crashed into the Egyptian center like a wave, and now they were tearing through it, their swords and maces and axes rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost mechanical. The Egyptians, caught off guard, tried to fight back, but they were not prepared for this. They had been trained to stand in formation, to hold the line, to wait for the enemy to come to them. They had not been trained for this sudden, savage, overwhelming violence. The GoodKnight's horse trampled a man beneath its hooves. He felt the sickening crunch, felt the animal stumble slightly, and then it was moving again, pushing deeper into the mass of bodies. The air was thick with dust and the smell of blood and sweat and fear. The GoodKnight's vision was limited to the narrow slit in his helmet, and everything he saw was fragmented, disjointed, a flash of a sword, a face twisted in pain, a banner falling, a horse rearing. He swung his sword again, and again and again. There was no thought, no strategy, no plan. There was only the fight. The GoodKnight's arm moved on instinct, his body reacting to threats before his mind could process them. A spear thrust toward his side, and he twisted in his saddle, letting it glance off his shield. An archer loosed an arrow at close range, and the GoodKnight felt it strike his shoulder. But the mail held, and the arrow fell away. A man grabbed at his leg, trying to pull him from his horse, and the GoodKnight brought the pommel of his sword down on the man's skull, feeling the bone give way beneath the steel. And then, suddenly, the pressure eased. The GoodKnight realized that he was through the first line. The Sudanese archers, the Arab infantry, they were behind him now, scattered and broken. Ahead, the Egyptian cavalry was turning, trying to regroup, trying to form a countercharge. But they were too slow. The momentum was with the Crusaders now, and momentum in a medieval battle was everything. King Baldwin was still at the front, his sword red to the hilt, his voice raised in a shout that the good knight could not make out over the roar of the battle. The king was heading straight for the Fatimid commander, straight for Sa'd al-Dawla al-Qawasi, and the good knight followed. The two forces met in a clash that seemed to shake the earth. The good knight's horse collided with an Egyptian cavalryman, and both animals staggered. The good knight swung his sword in a wide arc, and the blade caught the Egyptian across the neck, just below the line of his helmet. The man's head snapped back, and he fell from his saddle, blood spraying across the sand. The good knight did not watch him fall. He was already moving, already searching for the next threat. His sword was slick with blood now, and his arm was beginning to ache from the constant swinging, the constant impact. But he could not stop. To stop was to die. He saw King Baldwin engage Sa'd al-Dawla. The Fatimid commander was a skilled warrior, and he met the king's charge with a counter-strike that nearly unseated Baldwin from his horse. The two men traded blows, their swords ringing against each other, their horses circling. And then, in a move so fast that the good knight almost missed it, Baldwin feinted high and struck low, his blade slipping beneath Sa'd al-Dawla's guard and driving into the commander's side. Sa'd al-Dawla gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and then he fell. The effect was immediate. The Egyptian cavalry, seeing their commander fall, hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the Crusaders pressed their advantage. The good knight saw the enemy line waver, saw men begin to turn their horses, saw the first signs of panic spreading through the ranks. And then the Egyptians broke. It was not a slow retreat. It was a rout. The cavalry turned and fled, galloping back toward the safety of Ascalon. The infantry, seeing the cavalry abandon them, threw down their weapons and ran. The archers, who had stood so firm at the beginning of the battle, scattered like leaves in the wind. The good knight pulled his horse to a stop, his chest heaving, his vision swimming. Around him, the other knights of the 6th Division were doing the same, their horses blowing hard, their armor dented and bloodied. The battlefield was a scene of utter carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, Crusader and Egyptian alike, tangled together in death. The sand was dark with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of it. King Baldwin raised his sword above his head, and a cheer went up from the surviving Crusaders. They had won. Against all odds, against an army 10 times their size, they had won. But the good knight did not cheer. He sat on his horse, his sword still in his hand, and looked out across the field. He saw the bodies of his friends, his comrades, men he had fought beside for years. He saw Geldemar Carpinel, the lord of Haifa, lying face down in the sand, his armor shattered, his blood pooling beneath him. He saw the banners of the first 2 divisions trampled into the dirt. He saw the cost of victory, and he felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just a hollow, aching emptiness. The battle was over. But for the good knight, the weight of it was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Fog of War. The sun was at its zenith now, a merciless white disk that turned the sky into a furnace. The good knight dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had been in the saddle for hours, and his body was beginning to rebel, muscles cramping, joints stiff, the weight of his armor pressing down on him like a physical burden. Around him, the surviving knights were doing the same. Some were tending to their horses, checking for injuries, offering water from their canteens. Others were moving among the wounded, trying to separate those who could be saved from those who could not. The cries of the dying filled the air, a low, constant moan that seemed to blend with the wind. King Baldwin was already moving toward the Egyptian camp. The Fatimids had set up their base just beyond the battlefield, a sprawling collection of tents and supply wagons that had been abandoned in the rout. Baldwin, ever the pragmatist, knew that the spoils of war were as important as the victory itself. The kingdom of Jerusalem was perpetually short of funds, and the wealth of the Egyptian camp, gold, silver, weapons, armor, horses, would go a long way toward sustaining the kingdom through the coming months. The GoodKnight followed, though his heart was not in it. He had no interest in plunder. He had seen too much death today, too much blood, and the thought of rifling through the belongings of dead men made his stomach turn. But he followed anyway, because that was what soldiers did. They followed orders. They did what was necessary. The Egyptian camp was a treasure trove. Chests of gold coins, bolts of silk, crates of spices and perfumes. Weapons of every kind. Scimitars and daggers and bows. All of them finely crafted. All of them worth a small fortune. Horses, dozens of them, tethered to posts and whinnying nervously. And food, sacks of grain, barrels of dates and figs, jars of honey and oil. It was more wealth than the GoodKnight had seen in years, and it was all theirs for the taking. Baldwin moved through the camp with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He assigned men to guard the most valuable items, ordered others to begin loading the wagons, and set aside a portion of the spoils for the church. The king was a devout man, in his own way, and he understood the importance of keeping the clergy on his side. 1/10 of the plunder would go to the Hospital of St. John, a gesture that would earn him favor with the religious orders and ensure their continued support. The GoodKnight found a quiet corner of the camp and sat down on a crate. He removed his helmet, and the rush of cool air against his sweat-soaked hair was almost painful. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, tried to push away the images that kept flashing through his mind, the faces of the men he had killed, the sound of steel cutting through flesh, the weight of his sword as it rose and fell. He thought of Geldemar Carpinel. The Lord of Haifa had been a good man, a veteran of the First Crusade, a knight who had fought with honor and courage. And now he was dead, his body lying somewhere on that blood-soaked plain, waiting to be buried or burned or left for the scavengers. The GoodKnight had not known Geldemar well, but he had respected him. And now he was gone, just another name on the long list of the fallen. The GoodKnight opened his eyes and looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He clenched them into fists, trying to stop the tremor, but it did not help. His hands had a mind of their own now, a memory of the violence they had committed, and they would not be still. He heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see one of the other knights, a man named Reynold, a veteran from Normandy, standing over him. "You all right?" Reynold asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. The GoodKnight nodded, though it was a lie. "I'm fine." Reynold did not look convinced, but he did not press the issue. Instead, he sat down on the crate next to the GoodKnight and pulled out a wineskin. He took a long drink and then offered it to the GoodKnight. "Here, you look like you need it." The GoodKnight took the wineskin and drank. The wine was warm and sour, but it helped. It dulled the edges of the world, made everything a little less sharp, a little less real. "Hell of a fight," Reynold said, staring out at the battlefield. "I thought we were done for. I really did." The GoodKnight nodded. "So did I. But we made it. We're still here. Some of us." Reynold was silent for a moment, and then he sighed. "Yeah, some of us." They sat in silence, passing the wineskin, back and forth, watching as the other knights moved through the camp, loading the wagons, tending to the wounded. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon now, and the heat was finally starting to ease. But the weight of the day remained, pressing down on them, a burden that would not lift. And then, from the direction of Jaffa, a rider appeared. He was moving fast, his horse lathered with sweat, his face pale with fear. He rode straight to King Baldwin and dismounted in a rush, nearly falling in his haste. "My lord," the rider gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Jaffa, there are Egyptians at the gates. They say you are dead. They say the army is destroyed." Baldwin stared at the rider, his expression unreadable. "What?" "The survivors from the first divisions," the rider continued, his words tumbling over each other. "They fled to Jaffa. They told the garrison that you were killed, that the entire army was wiped out. The Egyptians, some of them, maybe 500, they followed the survivors to the city. They're at the gates now, trying to convince the garrison to surrender." For a moment, no one spoke. The knights who had gathered around the king stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just heard. The battle had been won. The Egyptians had been routed. And yet somehow the kingdom was on the verge of collapse. Baldwin's face darkened. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe less. I rode as fast as I could." The king turned to his men. "Mount up. We ride for Jaffa. Now." The good knight was already on his feet, his exhaustion forgotten. He grabbed his helmet and ran for his horse, his heart pounding. If Jaffa fell, if the garrison surrendered, then everything they had fought for today would be for nothing. The Egyptians would control the port, cutting off Jerusalem from the sea. The kingdom would be isolated, surrounded, doomed. They could not let that happen. The ride to Jaffa was a blur. The good knight pushed his horse as hard as he dared, following King Baldwin through the gathering dusk. The coastal road was rough and uneven, and more than once the good knight nearly lost his seat as his horse stumbled over rocks and ruts. But he did not slow down. None of them did. When they reached Jaffa, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city walls. The good knight could see the Egyptian soldiers at the gates, their banners still flying, their voices raised as they called out to the garrison inside. They were trying to negotiate, trying to convince the defenders that the battle was lost, that the king was dead, that resistance was futile. And then King Baldwin I rode into view. The effect was immediate. The Egyptians, seeing the king alive and at the head of his victorious army, turned and fled. They scattered in every direction, abandoning their banners, their weapons, their horses. Within minutes, they were gone, disappearing into the countryside like ghosts. The gates of Jaffa opened, and the garrison poured out, cheering and shouting. Baldwin's wife, Ada, was among them, her face streaked with tears. She ran to the king and threw her arms around him, and for a moment the hard, reckless warrior who had led the charge at Ramla was just a man, holding his wife, relieved to be alive. The good knight dismounted and stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as though he were observing the scene from a great distance. The cheers, the celebration, the relief, it all seemed hollow to him. They had won the battle. They had saved the kingdom. But at what cost? He thought of the men who had died on that sandy plain. He thought of Geldemar Carpinel, of the knights from the first 2 divisions, of the foot soldiers who had been cut down in the opening minutes of the fight. He thought of the Egyptians, too, the men he had killed, the men whose faces he could still see when he closed his eyes, and he wondered if any of it had been worth it. Chapter 4. The Weight of Survival. The days after the battle passed in a haze. The good knight moved through them mechanically, performing the tasks that were expected of him, helping to bury the dead, repairing his armor, tending to his horse. But his mind was elsewhere, lost in the memories of that September morning, replaying the charge, the clash, the killing. He did not sleep well. When he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men he had killed. He heard their screams, felt the impact of his sword against their bodies. And when he did manage to fall asleep, he was plagued by nightmares, dreams of being surrounded, of being pulled from his horse, of drowning in a sea of enemies. He was not alone in this. The other knights, the survivors of the 6th Division, were experiencing the same thing. Reynold, the Norman veteran, woke up screaming one night, convinced that the Egyptians were attacking the camp. Another knight, a young man from Flanders, refused to eat, sitting in his tent and staring at the wall for hours on end. The chaplain, Fulcher of Chartres, moved among them, offering prayers and blessings, but his words seemed to have little effect. The good knight knew what this was. He had seen it before, in the years after the First Crusade, in the veterans who had survived the siege of Jerusalem. The church called it a spiritual affliction, a burden placed on the soul by the act of killing. The knights themselves had no name for it, but they understood it. It was the weight of survival, the knowledge that they had lived while so many others had died, and the guilt that came with that knowledge. King Baldwin, to his credit, understood this as well. He made a point of visiting the survivors, speaking to them, reminding them of the importance of what they had done. He also made a generous donation to the Hospital of St. John, setting aside 1/10 of the spoils from the Egyptian camp to support the care of wounded pilgrims and soldiers. It was a gesture that served a dual purpose. It earned the king favor with the church, and it provided a way for the knights to channel their guilt into something constructive. The good knight found himself spending more time at the hospital. He helped the monks tend to the wounded, changing bandages, offering water, sitting with men as they died. It was hard work, and it did not ease the nightmares, but it gave him a sense of purpose. It reminded him that there was more to this war than just killing, that there was also healing and mercy and compassion. One evening, as the good knight was leaving the hospital, he was approached by Fulcher of Chartres. The chaplain was a small, wiry man with sharp eyes and a quick mind. He had been with Baldwin since the beginning, chronicling the king's campaigns, and he had a reputation for being both devout and pragmatic. "Walk with me," Fulcher said, and the good knight fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a while, moving through the narrow streets of Jaffa, past the market stalls and the workshops, and the houses where the city's residents were settling in for the night. The air was cool now, the oppressive heat of the day finally giving way to the gentle breeze that blew in from the sea. "You're troubled," Fulcher said at last. It was not a question. The good knight nodded. "I am." "You're not the only one. I've seen it in the others as well. The nightmares, the guilt, the sense that something inside you has been broken." The good knight did not respond. He did not know what to say. Fulcher stopped walking and turned to face him. "What you're feeling is not a sin. It's a sign that you are still human, that you have not lost your soul to the violence. The church teaches that killing in defense of the faith is not a sin, but that does not mean it is easy. It does not mean it does not leave a mark." "Then what do I do?" the good knight asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I carry this?" Fulcher was silent for a moment, and then he said, "You carry it by remembering why you fight. You fight to protect the innocent, to defend the holy city, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who came before you were not in vain. And you carry it by seeking forgiveness, not from me, not from the king, but from God. You pray, you confess, you do penance, and you trust that in time the weight will become bearable." The good knight looked down at his hands. They were still shaking, though not as badly as before. "And if it doesn't?" Fulcher placed a hand on the Itkar, good knight's shoulder. "Then you keep fighting anyway, because that is what it means to be a knight. You carry the weight, and you keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible. That is your duty, that is your burden, and that is your honor." The good knight nodded slowly. He did not feel comforted exactly, but he felt understood. And in that moment, that was enough. Chapter 5. The Legacy of Ramla. The victory at Ramla secured the Kingdom of Jerusalem for the remainder of 1101. The Fatimid Caliphate, reeling from the loss of their field army and the death of their commander, did not launch another major offensive that year. The coastal plain remained under Crusader control, and the vital supply line between Jaffa and Jerusalem was safe. But the victory came at a cost. 80 knights had been killed in the battle, nearly a third of the kingdom's cavalry. Dozens more had been wounded, some so severely that they would never fight again. The loss of Geldemar Carpinel, the lord of Haifa, was a particular blow, as he had been one of the most experienced and respected commanders in the kingdom. King Baldwin, ever the pragmatist, moved quickly to rebuild. He sent letters to Europe, calling for more knights and soldiers to come to the Holy Land. He negotiated alliances with the Italian maritime republics, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, securing their support in exchange for trading privileges. And he continued his aggressive campaign to capture the remaining Fatimid-held cities along the coast, knowing that the kingdom's survival depended on its ability to control the sea. But Baldwin also learned a lesson from Ramla. The victory had been won through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer luck. The charge of the 6th Division had succeeded because the Egyptians had been disorganized, because their commander had been killed, because the Crusaders had struck at exactly the right moment. But it could have easily gone the other way. If the Egyptians had held their formation, if Sa'd al-Dawla had not fallen, if Baldwin's gamble had failed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would have ceased to exist. In May 1102, just 8 months after the First Battle of Ramla, Baldwin would face the Egyptians again at the same location. This time, however, his overconfidence would nearly destroy him. Leading a force of only 200 to 500 knights, with no infantry support, Baldwin charged into a much larger Fatimid army and was utterly defeated. Many of his best knights were killed, including Stephen of Blois, one of the leaders of the First Crusade. Baldwin himself barely escaped, hiding in the reeds and fleeing on his horse, Gazelle. The Second Battle of Ramla was a disaster, and it served as a harsh reminder of the fragility of the Crusader states. The kingdom survived, but only because a new wave of pilgrims arrived from Europe just in time to lift the siege of Jaffa. The cycle of near destruction and miraculous survival would continue for years, with Baldwin fighting a third battle at Ramla in 1105, this time against a Fatimid army reinforced by Turkish horse archers. But the First Battle of Ramla remained the defining moment of Baldwin's reign. It was the battle that proved the kingdom could survive, that a small force of determined warriors could hold the line against overwhelming odds. And it was the battle that shaped the identity of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a state born in blood, sustained by violence, and defined by the courage and sacrifice of men like the Good Knight. Chapter 6. The Knight's Reflection. Years later, long after the battles at Ramla had faded into memory, the Good Knight would sometimes find himself standing on the walls of Jerusalem, looking out toward the west, toward the coastal plain where he had fought and bled and survived. He thought about the men he had killed. He thought about the friends he had lost. He thought about King Baldwin, who had led them into that desperate charge and somehow brought them out alive. And he thought about the weight he still carried, the burden that Fulcher of Chartres had told him was his duty, his honor. The nightmares had faded, but they had never truly gone away. There were still nights when he woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his hands reaching for a sword that was not there. There were still moments when he saw a face in the crowd and was reminded of one of the men he had killed, and the guilt would come rushing back, as fresh and raw as it had been on that September morning. But he had learned to live with it. He had learned to carry the weight. He had continued to fight, because that was what knights did. He had fought at the Second Battle of Ramla and the Third. He had fought at the sieges of Acre and Sidon and Beirut. He had fought in the deserts and the mountains and the valleys, always in his silver armor, always surviving, always moving forward. And through it all, he had held on to the belief that what he was doing mattered, that the kingdom he was defending was worth the cost, that the sacrifices of the men who had died at Ramla had not been in vain. He did not know if that belief was true. He did not know if any of it had been worth it. But he held on to it anyway, because without it, the weight would have been unbearable. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the city. The good knight turned away from the wall and walked back into the streets of Jerusalem, his silver armor glinting in the fading light. He had survived the First Battle of Ramla. He had survived the charge of the 6th Division, the vicious close-quarters combat, the heat and the blood and the chaos. He had survived the fog of war, the nightmares, the guilt. And he would continue to survive, because that was what he did. That was who he was. The good knight, a witness to history, a survivor of battles, a man who carried the weight of war and kept moving forward, even when it felt impossible. Epilogue. The crossroads Ramla stands today as a testament to the layers of history that have shaped the Levant. The city that was founded by the Umayyads in 716 AD, that served as the crossroads of the Via Maris and the road to Jerusalem, that witnessed the clash of Crusaders and Fatimids on that hot September morning in 1101, still exists. The great mosque of Ramla, originally built as a Crusader church, stands as a reminder of the complex and often violent history of the region. The White Tower, constructed in the 13th century, rises above the city, a silent witness to the centuries of conflict and coexistence that have defined this place. And beneath the city, in the vast network of cisterns built by the Umayyads and Abbasids, the water still flows, just as it did when the good knight and his companions fought to control this vital crossroads. The First Battle of Ramla was a turning point in the history of the Crusades. It proved that the Kingdom of Jerusalem could survive, that the Crusaders could hold the line against the might of the Fatimid Caliphate, but it also revealed the terrible cost of that survival, the lives lost, the trauma endured, the weight carried by those who fought. For the good knight, the battle was both a victory and a burden. He had survived, but he had been changed by what he witnessed. And that change, that weight, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The sand of Ramla remembers. It remembers the blood that was spilled, the men who died, the kingdom that was saved. And it remembers the knight in silver armor, who charged into the heart of the enemy and emerged on the other side, scarred but alive.